If you've been growing tomatoes for a while, you've probably heard completely opposite advice. Some people say you should water heavily because tomatoes use a huge amount of water during summer. Others claim that the less you water, the better your tomatoes will taste. And then there are people who simply water every day because that's how they've always done it. But the truth is that the biggest mistake isn't watering too much. And it isn't watering too little. The biggest mistake is focusing only on the plant. Most gardeners look at the leaves, look at the tomatoes, and make watering decisions based only on what they can see above the soil. But everything important is happening underground. A healthy tomato plant doesn't depend only on the water it receives today. It depends on the root system it has built over weeks and even months. And this is where one idea completely changed the way I grow tomatoes. We shouldn't be watering the tomato plant. We should be watering the soil. Because a tomato plant with a deep root system can handle heat waves, temperature swings, and occasional watering mistakes much better than a plant with shallow roots. On the other hand, a tomato plant that receives small amounts of water all the time often develops lazy roots. The roots stay close to the surface. And when a hot week arrives, that plant is usually the first one to struggle. So before we talk about gallons, drip irrigation, or watering schedules, we need to understand something much more important. The real goal of watering isn't simply to wet the plant. The goal is to build a soil that can store moisture, feed the roots, and keep them active throughout the entire growing season. When people talk about watering, they usually focus on one thing: water. But there's something just as important that many gardeners completely overlook. This is the air. Yes, roots need air to survive. In fact, healthy roots are constantly breathing. They need oxygen to produce energy and absorb both water and nutrients from the soil. That's why the perfect soil isn't soaking wet. And it isn't bone dry either. It's balanced. Think about a damp sponge. It contains water, but it also contains tiny pockets of air. That's exactly the kind of environment tomato roots love. The problem begins when we water too much. At first, everything may look fine. The plant is still green. The leaves look healthy. And nothing seems wrong. But underground, those air pockets begin filling with water. The roots have less and less oxygen available. And eventually, they start to suffocate. When that happens, the plant struggles to absorb nutrients efficiently, growth slows down, and it becomes much more vulnerable to disease. Many gardeners notice yellowing leaves and immediately assume the plant needs more water. But sometimes the exact opposite is true. The roots are already suffering from excess moisture. Of course, the other extreme isn't good either. If the soil stays too dry for too long, biological activity slows down, roots stop exploring new areas, and the plant begins to experience stress. That's why the goal should never be to keep the soil constantly wet. The goal is stable moisture. A soil that stays fresh. A soil that holds water. But also contains enough air for the roots to function properly. And once you understand this, you'll start to see why two gardeners can apply exactly the same amount of water and get completely different results. Because it's not only about how much you water. It's also about the kind of soil receiving that water. There was something that completely surprised me when I started learning how tomato plants actually work. And that's the fact that most of the water a tomato plant absorbs never becomes part of the tomato itself. In fact, most of it doesn't even stay inside the plant. So where does all that water go? The answer lies in a process called transpiration. And the easiest way to understand it is to compare it to something we do every day. When it's hot outside, we sweat. That sweat evaporates and helps cool our bodies down. Well, tomato plants do something very similar. Their leaves contain thousands of tiny openings called stomata. These microscopic pores open throughout the day, allowing the plant to exchange gases with the surrounding air. But while they're open, water also escapes as vapor. In other words, the plant is constantly losing water through its leaves. At first, that might sound wasteful. But it's actually one of the most important processes in the plant's life. Without transpiration, the plant can't cool itself efficiently. It can't move nutrients from the roots to the leaves. And it can't keep all of its internal systems running properly. In fact, when a tomato plant is growing rapidly, producing flowers, and developing fruit, its demand for water increases dramatically because of this process. And here's something many gardeners don't realize. The hotter the weather, the larger the plant, and the drier the air, the more water it will lose through transpiration. That's why two identical tomato plants can have completely different water needs depending on the conditions they're growing in. A mild spring week is nothing like a heat wave in the middle of summer. And once you understand transpiration, you'll start to see that many times when a tomato plant seems thirsty, it's actually working hard to keep itself cool. Because a huge portion of the water it absorbs isn't being used to make tomatoes. It's being used to keep the entire plant alive and functioning under challenging conditions. If you've been growing tomatoes for any length of time, you've probably seen it happen. You walk out to your garden. You spot a beautiful tomato that's almost ready to harvest. And then you notice a large crack running across the fruit. The first thing many gardeners think is that it's a disease. Or maybe insect damage. But in most cases, the real cause is much simpler. Water. To understand why tomatoes crack, imagine a balloon that's partially inflated. If you slowly add more air, the balloon expands without any problems. But if you suddenly force a large amount of air into it, the pressure increases quickly and the balloon can burst. Something very similar happens inside a tomato. When a plant goes through several days with limited water, fruit growth slows down. Then, if the plant suddenly receives a large amount of water, either from heavy rain or a deep watering, the roots quickly absorb that moisture. The plant sends part of that water into the fruit. And the tomato begins to swell. The problem is that the skin can only stretch so far. If the inside expands faster than the skin can keep up, cracks begin to form. That's why gardeners often notice split tomatoes right after a summer storm. Or after several hot, dry days followed by a heavy watering. And here's something important to understand. A cracked tomato doesn't necessarily mean you've been overwatering. Very often, it means the watering has been inconsistent. The plant went from having too little water to having too much water in a short period of time. That's why one of the best things you can do for your tomato plants is maintain consistent soil moisture. The soil doesn't need to stay wet all the time. What matters is avoiding dramatic swings between drought and saturation. Because tomato plants handle steady conditions much better than constant extremes. And interestingly, cracked tomatoes aren't the only consequence of irregular watering. They're often a warning sign that the plant is experiencing water stress. And when water stress becomes severe, it can affect much more than the appearance of your fruit. It can also reduce the plant's overall productivity and future harvests. When people think about a thirsty tomato plant, they usually picture wilted leaves. And yes, that can happen. But the real problems often begin long before the plant shows any obvious signs of stress. Because a tomato plant doesn't use water just to stay alive. It needs water for almost everything it does. It needs water to move nutrients from the roots. It needs water to produce sugars through photosynthesis. It needs water to develop new growth. It needs water to produce flowers. And it needs water to fill and enlarge the fruit. That's why when water becomes limited, the plant enters survival mode. And when a plant goes into survival mode, it starts making difficult decisions. Think of it like a business going through a financial crisis. The first thing that usually gets cut is future projects. A tomato plant behaves in a very similar way. When it experiences water stress, it often slows its growth, reduces the development of new shoots, and may even struggle to support all of its flowers. And this is incredibly important to understand. Because every flower that fails to develop properly today is a tomato you won't harvest weeks from now. That's why some gardeners see plenty of flowers on their plants but end up with far fewer tomatoes than expected. Water stress can be one of the reasons. But there's another common problem that many tomato growers have experienced. Blossom end rot. That dark, sunken patch that appears on the bottom of the fruit. Many people assume it's caused by a disease. But in many cases, it's related to calcium transport within the plant. And here's the interesting part. The soil may actually contain enough calcium. The problem isn't always a lack of nutrients. The problem is that the plant needs water to move calcium from the roots to the developing fruit. When watering becomes irregular, or when the plant experiences repeated periods of drought stress, that transport system can be disrupted. And that's when blossom end rot begins to appear. So when we talk about watering, we're not just talking about preventing a plant from getting thirsty. We're talking about supporting every process that allows a tomato plant to grow, flower, and produce healthy fruit. And that brings us to one of the most common questions in gardening. How much water does a tomato plant actually need? And while it might sound frustrating, the honest answer is: it depends. There isn't one magic number that works for every garden. Because tomato plants don't all grow under the same conditions. A newly transplanted seedling has completely different needs than a 6-foot-tall plant loaded with fruit in the middle of summer. But there's another factor that's even more important. Your soil. Imagine two identical tomato plants. Same variety. Same age. Same weather. The only difference is the soil they're growing in. One is planted in sandy soil. The other is growing in rich soil full of organic matter. The sandy soil drains quickly. Water moves through it fast and doesn't stay available for very long. The richer soil behaves more like a sponge. It can store moisture and release it slowly over time. And this is where many gardeners get into trouble. They try to copy someone else's watering schedule. Maybe they hear that a gardener waters for 20 minutes every day. Or 1 hour every 3 days. So they do exactly the same thing. But what works perfectly in one garden can be completely wrong in another. Because every soil holds water differently. A sandy soil usually requires more frequent watering. A soil rich in organic matter can often go much longer between waterings. That's why two gardeners can follow the exact same schedule and get completely different results. And this leads to an important realization. Instead of asking, how many gallons should I give my tomato plants? A better question is, how long does my soil stay moist after watering? Because the goal isn't to follow a schedule. The goal is to provide consistent moisture while allowing the roots to breathe. And once you start thinking this way, you'll stop chasing numbers and start paying attention to what really matters. The condition of the soil itself. And that's exactly what we'll talk about next. Because if you know how to read your soil, you'll always know when it's time to water. At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, I understand why watering matters. I understand what happens when I overwater. And I understand what happens when I don't water enough. But how do I actually know when it's time to water? The good news is that you don't need expensive sensors. You don't need a weather station. And you definitely don't need a complicated app. Your best tool is still observation. The first thing I recommend is forgetting about watering on a fixed schedule. Tomato plants don't know whether it's Monday or Thursday. They only respond to the conditions around them. That's why before turning on the irrigation, the most important thing you can do is check the soil. And the simplest method is still the finger test. Push your finger a few inches into the soil. Don't just check the surface. The top layer can be completely dry from the sun while deeper down there's still plenty of moisture available to the roots. If the soil feels cool and slightly damp, your plant probably doesn't need water yet. If it feels dry several inches below the surface, then it's time to start thinking about watering. Another useful clue is the plant's growth. A well-watered tomato plant usually looks vigorous. The leaves feel firm. New shoots are growing actively. And the plant seems full of energy. When water starts becoming limited, growth often slows down before any dramatic symptoms appear. But here's a mistake many gardeners make. They see leaves drooping in the middle of a hot afternoon and immediately assume the plant needs water. Sometimes that's true. But not always. During extreme heat, tomato plants can temporarily wilt even when there's plenty of moisture in the soil. It's simply a response to the intense conditions. That's why it's much better to check the plant early in the morning or later in the evening. If the leaves are still drooping at those times, then water stress may actually be the cause. Over time, you'll discover something interesting. The best watering guide isn't a calendar. It isn't a chart. And it isn't a number of gallons per week. It's a combination of understanding your soil and paying attention to your plants. Because once you learn to read those signals, watering becomes much less about guessing and much more about understanding what your garden is telling you. If I told you that a significant portion of the water you give your tomato plants never actually reaches the roots, you might think I'm exaggerating. But it's true. A lot of water is lost before the plant ever has a chance to use it. It simply evaporates. And the hotter the weather gets, the bigger this problem becomes. The good news is that there are several ways to reduce water loss without sacrificing growth or production. And the first one is, in my opinion, the most powerful of all. Mulch. Something as simple as covering the soil with straw, shredded leaves, grass clippings, or other organic materials can completely change the way your garden holds moisture. Think about a forest floor. You'll almost never see bare soil. Nature constantly protects the ground with a layer of organic matter. That protective layer acts like insulation. It reduces evaporation. It keeps the soil cooler. And it helps create a stable environment for roots and beneficial soil organisms. The exact same thing happens in a tomato garden. A well-mulched plant often requires less frequent watering because the soil is able to hold on to moisture much longer. The second strategy is managing excessive foliage. Now, this doesn't mean stripping all the leaves off your plants. Leaves are essential. They're the solar panels that power the entire plant. But when a tomato plant develops an excessive amount of unnecessary growth, it also increases the amount of water lost through transpiration. That's why thoughtful pruning can sometimes help the plant use its resources more efficiently. And the third strategy is one that's widely used by professional growers. Light shading during extreme heat. This doesn't mean depriving tomato plants of sunlight. Tomatoes still need plenty of sun to produce a great harvest. But during intense summer heat, a light shade cloth can reduce stress during the hottest part of the day. And when the plant is under less heat stress, it doesn't have to work as hard just to stay cool. Which means it can use water more efficiently. In the end, the secret isn't always giving your plants more water. Sometimes it's simply preventing the water you already have from being wasted. Because many gardeners don't actually have a watering problem. They have a water loss problem. And once you solve that, everything becomes easier. After years of growing tomatoes and talking with gardeners from all kinds of climates and growing conditions, I've noticed something interesting. Most watering problems don't happen because people give their plants too much water. And they don't happen because people give them too little water. They happen because of small mistakes that get repeated week after week. And today I want to show you the 5 most common ones. The first mistake is giving a little bit of water every single day. At first, it seems like a good idea. The plant always has moisture available. But what often happens is that the roots become lazy. Instead of growing deeper into the soil, they stay near the surface where the water is. And when a heat wave arrives, those shallow roots are the first to suffer. The second mistake is watering on a fixed schedule. Some gardeners water every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. No matter what. It doesn't matter if it rained yesterday. It doesn't matter if temperatures dropped by 20 degrees. They water because it's on the calendar. But tomato plants don't care about schedules. They care about conditions. That's why the soil should always have the final say. The third mistake is allowing the plant to swing between drought and saturation. Several days with very little water followed by a heavy watering. This roller coaster effect creates stress, increases the risk of fruit cracking, and forces the plant to constantly adapt instead of growing efficiently. The fourth mistake is leaving the soil completely bare. Especially during the hottest part of summer. Direct sunlight hits the soil surface all day long, increasing evaporation and causing moisture to disappear much faster than most gardeners realize. Many people think they need to water more when what they really need is better soil protection. And the fifth mistake might be the most common of all. Using water as the solution to every problem. Yellow leaves, add water. Slow growth, add water. Drooping leaves, add water. But many plant problems have nothing to do with thirst. And sometimes adding more water only makes the situation worse. That's why one of the most valuable skills a gardener can develop is learning to observe before reacting. Look at the soil. Look at the plant. Look at the overall growing conditions. Because healthy tomato plants usually give us warning signs long before serious problems appear. And once you learn how to read those signals, growing tomatoes becomes a whole lot easier. After everything we've covered so far, you're probably waiting for a simple answer. So how do I actually water my tomato plants? The truth is, I don't use the exact same watering strategy throughout the entire season. Because a newly transplanted seedling has completely different needs than a mature plant loaded with fruit. When I first transplant my tomatoes, my main goal isn't rapid growth. My goal is root establishment. During those first days, I focus on maintaining consistent moisture around the root zone to help the plant recover from transplant shock and settle into its new home. Once I see new growth appearing, my approach changes. I begin allowing a little more time between waterings. Not enough to stress the plant, but enough to encourage the roots to search deeper into the soil. I don't want a comfortable plant. I want a strong plant. I want roots that grow down instead of staying near the surface. Because those deep roots are what help a tomato plant survive the hottest weeks of summer. Then comes one of the most important stages of the entire season. Flowering and fruit set. At this point, consistency becomes extremely important. This is when the plant is deciding how much of your future harvest it's capable of producing. Large swings between dry and wet conditions can interfere with flower development and fruit production. So during this stage, I try to keep soil moisture as stable as possible. Later, when the plants are full of developing tomatoes, I continue providing steady moisture without dramatic changes. No flooding. No drought. Just consistency. And when the first tomatoes begin ripening, I do something that surprises many gardeners. I don't increase watering. Because one of the most common causes of cracked tomatoes is suddenly giving the plant more water than it's used to receiving. Instead, I keep doing what has worked all season long. I maintain stability. And honestly, if there's one word that summarizes this entire video, it's that word. Stability. I don't want my plants growing in a swamp. And I don't want them struggling through drought. I want a living soil. A soil with moisture. A soil with air. A soil full of life. Because when you create those conditions, many of the common tomato growing problems start to disappear on their own. And eventually, something interesting happens. You stop following rules. You stop chasing numbers. And you start understanding your plants. Because the longer you grow tomatoes, the more you realize that the plants are constantly telling you what they need. You just have to learn how to listen. Take care of your soil, and your soil will take care of your plants. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.